Hello, I've been asked to introduce our speakers today at the panel discussion, Understanding Antisemitism. And they're going to speak in this order. Professor Robert Cargill from Religious Studies, Professor Elizabeth Heineman from History, and Rabbi Esther Hugenholtz from Agudas Achim Synagogue. And then following their comments, there will be discussion.
Did you want to say anything to open us up?
I think we're good to go.
Are you sure? Okay. All right, I'll just say a few. There are a few seats still here in the center. If we're not saving, there was a few seats if we're looking for a seat. 2, 1. Okay. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. And to all of you remotely, speak to the camera back there, thank you for being here as well. We were all devastated by the events of last Saturday. And so, with many thanks to Professor Heineman for very quickly putting together a panel that would discuss what happened, maybe beginning to understand why some of this happened, and then maybe take some questions and see what can we possibly do. So my name is Robert Cargill. I'm a assistant professor of classics and religious studies here in the departments of classics and religious studies here at the University of Iowa. And I've been asked to talk about the religious origins of anti-Semitism. And so if you can peek over my shoulder here, I put together some slides that will maybe discuss some of the origins of where anti-Jewish sentiment comes from. Many of you know that Constantine I issued the Edict of Milan legalizing Christianity back in 313 CE. And later, the emperors Theodosius, Gratian, and Valentinian II issued the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 CE, making Nicene Christianity, a particular understanding, a version of Christianity, the official Roman state religion. And at that time, up until that time and then after that time, Jews became a tolerated minority when economic times were good, but were often understood to be a scapegoat when economic times were bad. And the term that often came up was Christ killers. And so the question is, as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and then spread throughout Europe, and then ultimately spread over to the Americas, did what was taught back in the first century have anything to do with maybe what we see today? That is there any anti-Semitism in the New Testament? The verse that made headlines was John 8:44. The reason it made headlines is it was on the social media profile of the murderer. You'll see here on his Gab website, Jews are the children of Satan, John 8:44. And this has often been a verse that has been used to give license to the murder, or at least to the discrimination or the persecution of Jews. You are from your father the devil, and you choose to do your father's desires. He was a murderer, the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him, and on and on. He's a liar. You are not from God. And so, because of what Jesus is said to have said in the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verse 44, some Christians, and I need to underscore this, because there are also some people who want to blame all Christians for this, and all religion for this. No. Some Christians, with a very strict fundamentalist reading of the Bible, want to blame some verses like this for giving license in a misinterpretation of Scripture to do harm to Jews. John 8:44 is an internal Jewish dispute between Jewish interpreters of religious tradition. And they called each other names, right? Jesus called his religious opponents children of the devil. Jesus called people names, by the way. He called people, you brood of vipers. You are evil. In Luke 11:40, you fools. Which is interesting because in the Beatitudes he says, in the Sermon on the Mount he says, if you call someone you fool, you stand in danger of the flames of hell. And yet in Luke 11:40, you fools. Jesus called people names. And of course his religious opponents called him names. They called him a Samaritan, which wasn't a nice thing to call him, especially when Jesus wasn't a Samaritan, he was a Galilean, right? And they called him demon-possessed. This was an internal Jewish dispute. It was a Jew named Jesus arguing about religious interpretation with other Jews, okay? The problem comes when later Christians took this verse as Jesus being one of them. Remember, I said this before, Jesus was a Jew. He was circumcised on the 8th day. Some of you know the story of when he was 12 years old, his parents lost him for a little while, and they went back to find him. They didn't find him in church. They found him in the temple, right? He went to the synagogue and started reading from the Isaiah scroll, and then they chased him out, right? Jesus was Jewish. But when you take this verse out of the 1st century into the 2nd century, when Judaism and Christianity had started to distance themselves from one another, and you claim Jesus as a Christian, Jesus wasn't a Christian, he was a Jew. But when you claim Jesus as a Christian, and Jesus is no longer having an internal Jewish dispute with other Jews, but all Jews now are children of Satan, and Jesus is no longer a Jew, he's a Christian, then you begin to see the problem. When this verse is taken out of its context, we see the problem. This was an intra-Jewish dispute, but once it's removed from that context, now the accusations against the religious authorities can be applied to all Jews. And that's what some, not all, some Christians do. Remember, John isn't anti-Semitic, nor is Jesus. Why? In John 4, the very same gospel, you have the story of Jesus with the woman at the well, and he says, you worship what you don't know, we worship what we know, for salvation is of the Jews. That is not a very anti-Semitic statement coming from the mouth of Jesus. Salvation is from the Jews. How do you reconcile that with John 8:44? This was an internal Jewish dispute among Jews. Okay? Matthew 23:31-33. Thus you testify against yourselves, you are descendants of those who murdered the prophets. You snakes, you brood of vipers. Jesus is talking to other fellow Jews, specifically to interpreters of the Jewish tradition with whom he disagrees. And he calls them names. Matthew 27. This is another verse that has been used as justification for killing Jews throughout the centuries. This is the trial of Jesus. During the trial of Jesus, some Jewish leaders who wanted Jesus dead stirred up Pilate, who wanted to let him go according to the text. And Pilate says, I wash my hands, I'm innocent of this man's blood. And he said, well, his blood be on us and our children. This was an intra-Jewish dispute. By the way, there are many scholars who think the and our children, which is the line that is used to say, aha, see here, his blood be on us and our children, we have license to persecute Jews forever, right? Was actually put there to limit it. The idea was only us and our children standing next to us are the ones whose blood is on our hands. You can't persecute Jews forever. It's only this generation. We're the ones responsible for his death. But that's not how some Christian fundamentalists interpret this verse. 1 Thessalonians 2:14-16. You have a very strange verse coming from the Apostle Paul, who, in his letter to the Romans, went out of his way to talk about the importance and the significance of the Jewish people in the history of salvation. And then you have, for you, brothers and sisters, become imitators of churches of God in Christ that are in Judea, for you suffered the same things from your own compatriots as they did the Jews. And then you get this very strange, who killed both the Lord Savior and the Lord Jesus and the prophets, and drove us out. They displease God and oppose everyone by hindering us from speaking to the Gentiles, so that they might be saved. They thus have constantly been filling up the measure of their sins, but God's wrath has overtaken them at last. Many critical scholars, if you read commentaries, will point out that these verses, after the words the Jews, are a later interpolation. If you don't know what interpolation means, this means that these verses were added at a later time. Look at the grammar. The Jews, and then all these dependent clauses. Who killed the Lord and Savior? Who drove us out? They displease everyone. Somebody came along at a period after the Christians and the Jews had been separated and tacked these verses on. This happens quite a bit in the New Testament, by the way. If you don't believe me, look at the footnote at the end of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16, verse 9. There's a big footnote that says all of the verses after verse 9 don't appear in any of the earliest manuscripts. They came back and added a lot of stuff. So later, when anti-Semitism got really big within the Christian community, they came back and added this verse. But there it is in Scripture, giving license to some to persecute Jews. And then, of course, the Synagogue of Satan passages in Revelation 2:9 and 3:9. Again, an inter-Jewish dispute between those Christians who believe, those Jews who believe Jesus to be the Jewish Messiah, and those Jews who don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. And those who believe Jesus is Messiah refer to those Jews as the Synagogue of Satan. They called each other names. You also have the idea, the problem, of Hebrews 8, which leads to a concept we call supersessionism. This is the idea that Christians believe that the Jews have been replaced. We call it replacement theology. The Christians, the people of the new covenant, excuse me, have replaced the Jews as the people of God. And this is what we find throughout the book of Hebrews. Would it be possible to get some water? Just a little water. Thank you, Nick. When we move beyond the Bible, we see a lot of the manuscripts that were written after the Bible actually really ratchet this anti-Semitism up. The Epistle of Barnabas, which is actually in Codex Sinaiticus, it's in one of the earliest Bibles we have, but it wasn't ultimately canonized, actually says the supersessionist ideology, right? He abolished in order that the new law of Lord Jesus Christ be established. And you get more supersessionism. The Epistle of Barnabas, by the way, is actually one of the most anti-Semitic extra-testamental books that we have. And then the church fathers come along and pick up on this in reference to the Jews, that you and only you might suffer the afflictions that are now justly yours on your land, that it might be desolated, your cities be ruined by fire, your land be eaten by strangers before your eyes, not one of you be entered to be allowed to enter your city. This is Justin Martyr. Look at Origen of Alexandria. The Jews, for they have committed the most abominable crimes in forming this conspiracy against Jesus. They're blaming him for killing Jesus. Augustine, how I wish that you would slay them, O God, the Jews, with a two-edged sword, that there would be none to oppose your word. Gladly I would have them die to themselves and live to you. And then, of course, one of the most anti-Semitic preachers in antiquity, John Chrysostom, I'm not going to read the whole thing. They are fit for killing. They grew fit for slaughter because they crucified Jesus. There are several codes and edicts that I won't articulate that take place throughout history. As the church is making new law and issuing new edicts on what Christians believe, they are also issuing edicts against Jews. Jewish doctors aren't allowed to treat Christian patients. Jews and Christians aren't allowed to intermarry, etc., all the way down through the Middle Ages. Jews were a tolerated minority. Oftentimes, Jews weren't allowed to have any power whatsoever, authority over Christians. It gives rise to the myth of blood libel. The myth in 1144 that Jews murdered Christian children to use their blood for Passover unleavened bread. The bubonic plague was blamed on Jews. And the financier stereotype. Because handling money was considered sinful, that was the job that the Christian Europeans allowed the Jews to do. And when they began doing it a lot, they then blamed them for any economic downturn. And then, of course, there's Martin Luther, one of the fathers of the Reformation, who wrote a document called Against the Jews and Their Lies. This damned, rejected race of Jews, their lying and blasphemy and cursing, their synagogue should be set on fire. This ought to be done for the honor of God and of Christianity, on and on and on and on and on and on. They are a venomous, bitter, vindictive, tricky serpents, assassins, children of the devil, who sting. This is Martin Luther and what he says. And then, of course, we know about the Crusades and the Inquisition and the Holocaust. It is from the New Testament itself that some Christians get their license to harm Jews. Jesus said it, the church fathers echoed it, the Reformationists really drove it home, and for a while there, this was considered to be the norm, until places like the United States were established, a secular nation, where you had the freedom to worship as you saw fit. Jews were still persecuted, as you're going to hear. But this was supposed to be a place where this didn't happen anymore. Thank you. And yet, here we are. Thank you.
I do. Thank you. Well, thank you. I want to express my appreciation both to Professor Cargill and to Rabbi Hugenholtz for agreeing to take part in this rather hastily arranged forum. And I also very much appreciate those in the audience who also made time in their schedule at short notice. Obviously, we feel a deep sense of urgency about this, and it is good to see confirmed a concern and a desire on part of members of the community to learn more about the subject. I am a historian. I'm going to start with a very contemporary question, but I'm very quickly going to revert to my old habits and take us back in time and be a historian again. But here's what I want to start off with. I want to start off with a question that so often comes up with my students, with friends, with people in the community who are just trying to figure things out, and that is how to understand anti-Semitism in the world in which we live, the society in which we live, in which we tend to understand prejudice mainly through the lens of color-based racism. Now, there are a lot of reasons that we in our society think about discrimination and prejudice on the basis of color-based racism, having to do with our own history. And who typically enjoy white privilege in some forms. I'm going to give you a history lecture on this topic, and what I'm going to do is first say two quick preliminary things about race and whiteness and Jewishness, and then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about conspiracy and conspiracy theory as a helpful tool for understanding how this actually functions and what distinguishes anti-Semitism from racism and what brings them together. So two preliminaries. One is a warning that to think of Jews as white renders Jews of color invisible. There are a lot of Jews of color from Central and South Asia, from Central and South America, people who would check Hispanic on their census form, African Americans who are Jewish. And in the last few days, I've seen some really beautiful and heart-rending writings by African American Jews about their feelings in light of both the racially motivated murders in Louisville and the Pittsburgh shootings motivated by anti-Semitism. The second thing I want to quickly say about thinking of Jews as white is that the color-based racial framework is not the only racial framework that has existed in history. When we look at our census forms in this country, race tends to be associated with continents, like African American, or Asian and Pacific Islander, or Hispanic, or Native American, or white, which in parentheses says of European or Middle Eastern origin, okay? That's our history. We associate with this with continents, and we tend to think of it in connection with color. Racial science, such as it is, which emerged in the 19th century, which then became very influential in government bureaucracies, so for example, helped to determine what goes on the census forms or what various citizenship categories are. Racial science, as it emerged, also dug deeper. So the early racial scientists, you see this in, the classic example is Nazi Germany, but you certainly see it in American eugenics science in Great Britain, will distinguish among Europeans, people who we tend to lump under the category white, but they would say, well, there's Nordic, those are North Europeans, and there's Latinic, those are the Spaniards and the French and the Italians and the Portuguese, and there's Slavic, those are the East European, and there are Jews, those are European Jews. So understand that the language of race is not limited to a kind of blanket whiteness for Europeans, and this has left a legacy. Nevertheless, the fantasies of anti-Semites that we're talking about European origin, clearly think them as very other, but they often, the pictures you see, the nasty sketches you see, are not of African American Jews. They are of Jews who we would call white, and that's what I want to dig into. It is a very important part of understanding anti-Semitism today. The crucial point here is not that Jews can also be understood as an other race, like other minorities, but the important point here is that the very fact of Jews' apparent whiteness makes them dangerous in different ways than people who are easily identifiable as not white in the eyes of anti-Semites, okay? It is not simply another form of racism, it really is something different, but as we'll see, it is interconnected with color-based racism, as most Americans today understand it. This is where we get to the world of conspiracy. And here's the premise. Jews, as we know from Professor Cargill's lecture, it's important to understand the depth of what he's talking about. This is not just stereotypes of Jews who are greedy or Jews who spread disease. The point is that Jews are responsible for the most profound evil possible, the killing of the Christian Savior. That is metaphysical evil. That's not sort of earthly stuff, right? And since through the centuries, Jews refused to acknowledge that and refused to convert, basically, they are driven to continue doing evil, okay? This is a notion, again, of metaphysical evil. What happens, and Professor Cargill started to get into this a little bit, is that that then translates itself very easily into how to understand human suffering on Earth. When the bubonic plague hits in Europe, they don't understand infectious disease. Perhaps it's because the Jews poisoned the wells, and that's why a third of Europe dies in the space of a couple of years. When a Christian child mysteriously disappears, perhaps he hasn't just gotten lost or fallen on a bad end by, who knows what, some natural disaster. Perhaps Jews have captured that child and murdered that child in order to use its blood for ritual purposes. And this is an image I have up here. This is the so-called blood libel, the notion, well, actually it's the opposite. But the notion that Jews use Christian children's blood for ritual purposes, okay, really profound metaphysical evil, to explain some of people's deepest anxieties. Why do children disappear? Why do you have diseases that kill off huge numbers of people, right? These are really deep anxieties. All of this activity must be secretive because, after all, Jews are a small minority and they're living under duress, but because they have to act in secrecy, it makes them that much more dangerous. okay? So they're not kind of out in the open being dangerous, they're in secret. They must be, and this is sort of medieval Europe talking, we're here now, they must be strictly cordoned off. In some cases, thrown out of entire countries, thrown out of Spain in 1492, thrown out of England already in the 13th century. In some places, permitted to live, but within very clear confines, either in literal ghettos or in this part of the country, but not that part of the country, and also economically segregated. So they're not engaged in economic activity with everybody, but isolated in very specific places. Now that segregation isn't complete, and again picking up on Professor Cargill's themes, in some places Christian elites call on Jews to perform certain kinds of economic functions that Christians either can't perform or don't want to perform, okay? Such as the lending of money, okay? There are prohibitions against usury, okay? Lending money for interest, that means Christians aren't supposed to do it. Not all Christians follow their own laws. Some Christians are perfectly okay doing it, but still they'd rather not have to do it because if things go south, wouldn't it be, many sort of Christian elites will bring on Jews to do this job for them in order to have kind of someone in the middle. You have sort of a member of the aristocracy here, the peasants here, a Jewish kind of go-between to handle finances. So if things get ugly, they're blaming the Jew. So there's sort of a religious thing going on here, but also a socio-economic thing going on here. This is obviously, money lending is a necessary function of an economy. You want to start a business, you need to borrow money, okay? And then once your business takes off, you're going to pay that money back with a little bit of interest. This is how capitalism works. And financiers are absolutely central to the development of capitalism in Europe. But again, when people suffer because of it, or when there are economic downturns, it becomes very easy to blame Jews for that. Now, starting with the French Revolution, one country after the other emancipates the Jews. And what that means is that they lift legal restrictions and they permit Jews access to citizenship, to all realms of activity in the economy, to holding political office, to all areas of residence. Jews become full and equal citizens. And this happens progressively. So it starts in France. The last European country to emancipate its Jews is the Soviet Union upon the Russian Revolution. The Jews are finally emancipated in the Soviet Union. It's a process. Around the same time occurs an event called the Jewish Enlightenment. And when we think about the European Enlightenment and the impact that had on religion, so Christianity is increasingly challenged by science, and Christians are challenged to find ways to reconcile their Christianity with science. So, for example, the idea that the sun and not the earth is the center of the universe. The idea that the idea of biological evolution. Thank you so much. Which Darwin's discoveries of evolution, which challenge Christian beliefs in how the world and various species were created. You have that process happening among Christians. It happens among Jews as well. And one impact of that is that many Jews themselves become somewhat more casual in their observance, and they begin, in combination with emancipation, assimilating more to mainstream society. That might mean, for example, dropping the distinctive language, either Yiddish or Ladino, and adopting the majority language to integrate more into the economy. It might mean dropping distinctive dress. It might mean taking jobs that you previously wouldn't have been able to take, okay? So both of these things together, political emancipation and the Enlightenment, combined to make it more possible for Jews to engage in various levels of assimilation. Now, almost all retain some distinct Jewish practices, like celebrating the major holidays and life cycle rituals, and many continue to follow all aspects of Jewish dietary law, and so on and so forth. Nevertheless, they're participating in the economy, they are voting, they're holding political office. Anti-Semites are made extremely anxious by this. Jews, in their mind, are no less evil than before, but now they're in a position to practice that evil more effectively because now they can infiltrate mainstream society. How are they going to do that? I'm going to take us through some images to sort of help us understand via very specific historical episodes. In the late 19th century, there's a major scandal in France where a Jewish French army officer, such a thing couldn't have existed 120 years earlier, a Jewish French army officer is falsely accused of treason. He is tried, he is convicted. There's a major wave of anti-Semitism in France. There are also defenders of the Jewish French officer who say, wait a second, the liberal state has to acknowledge him as a citizen like anybody else. But it reveals the tensions and it reveals the anxieties of anti-Semites. Prior to emancipation, you could have had a Jewish army officer. Now you can, and he might threaten national security by selling secrets to the Germans. We got that one already, excuse me. Purported conspiracy to undermine economies, and this is a really interesting one. The notion that Jews might secretly be masterminding capitalism, and we can see that already has a centuries-long tradition, the idea of Jews as masterminding capitalism. But now a more modern variant, Jews as the secret masterminds of communism. And this is really important because what it really reflects is that the notion that it's really about Jews being evil. So if capitalism is what's making Christians suffer, then Jews are responsible for capitalism. If communism is what's making Christians suffer, then Jews are responsible for communism. It's not about by a people who can infiltrate. Purported conspiracy to poison minds through culture. Jews can now be part of the movie industry. And here we see a leaflet protesting Jewish Hollywood, which associates Jews with vice and dope and gambling, where young Gentile girls are raped by Jewish producers and so on and so on. And communism is in for the mix, okay? To the other side, just a couple of years earlier, absolutely classic Nazi propaganda associating Jews with the theater scene, the movie scene, newspapers, sexual education, sexual morality. The notion that Jews can poison the minds of people via their cultural influence now that they're permitted to have a part in it. And very importantly, a purported conspiracy against the white race. Okay? For those whose anxieties of being modern have to do with racial mixing in other kinds of terms. And again, a sort of putting together a Nazi and American propaganda, this music for a degenerate, this poster for an exhibit of degenerate music in Nazi Germany. Degenerate is African-American jazz. There's a reason it's a saxophone. The idea that African-American jazz is a foreign, degenerating, dangerous impulse. But if you're racist in those terms against Africans, you might adhere to the belief that Africans and people of African descent aren't smart enough to pull it off on their own. Who do they need? They need to the Jews actually to mastermind the whole thing, okay? Likewise, here we have a leaflet from the Jim Crow South blaming Jews for racial mixing. So there's a lot of things going on, a lot of anxieties, whether they're about political structures, global security, whether they're about the economy, about culture, about race as defined by color. Somehow the Jews can be behind it all because although they're a tiny minority, they can infiltrate. Finally, we get the absolute classic of conspiracy theory, which is something called variously the Protocols of the Elders of Zion or the Protocols of the Meetings of the Learned Elders of Zion. This is a forgery. It appears initially to have possibly been put together in late 19th century Russia, or at least that was the claim. And what it claims to be is two reporters kind of sitting in as spies on a meeting of the elders of Zion. That means the masters of the worldwide Jewish conspiracy. And what they then do is they put together this pamphlet that goes chapter by chapter, how we are going to break up the economy, how we are going to break up religious feeling, how we are going to ruin the youth, how we are going to interfere with the economy. Literally, chapter by chapter, a complete catalog of this supposed Jewish conspiracy for world domination in every sphere. It is translated into numerous languages. It is published in the United States as well. It appears all over the world. It is still very much circulated by the anti-Semitic white supremacist circles. All right, where does that leave us today? Well, first of all, we see a few common elements. First, the notion that Jews' evil is not specific to this characteristic or that. It's not that they're greedy capitalists, okay? It's not that they're not traitors to their nation, you know, like Dreyfus, okay? It's that they are metaphysically evil. And that then can translate to any sphere of life. Another common element is that Jews are attributed with far more power than they actually have. In all of these societies...
Trust me, just ask me as a rabbi.
Yeah.
You know, can't even get the service to start on time.
There you go. And that they use that power in secret, which, by the way, helps to explain why we have so little actual evidence of any of this, okay? We don't need to worry about evidence because, of course, there's no evidence because they do it all in secret. And finally, they exercise that power not directly, but via other people whom they control, or institutions they control from behind the scenes. Now, let's take a look at some present-day pieces of anti-Semitic iconography sort of in the world we're in, like right now. First of all, many of you will know that George Soros, who was born and grew up in Hungary, a survivor of the German occupation, Holocaust in Hungary, came to the United States and became a very wealthy capitalist. He did very well in the world of finance. He is very often attached to all kinds of conspiracies. You recognize this imagery of grasping the globe, right? You've seen this before. You saw it right here, grasping the globe. You saw it, wait a second. You saw it here, grasping the globe, right? This is really familiar stuff. This is, of course, not just in the United States. In Hungary itself, which is now an authoritarian racial state, essentially, the government itself has attacked Soros. Soros himself came out in favor of much more generous immigration and refugee policies at the time of Europe's refugee crisis a couple of years ago. Hungary is kind of on the border and was almost the gateway, and Soros was saying we have to admit these people who are desperately fleeing violence and persecution. The government begged to differ, and they basically target him. Let's not leave Soros the last laugh, and this image of him laughing. This is a very common theme with George Soros. Any numbers of images of Soros as the puppet master. Again, he's behind the scenes. Here he's manipulating the Pope. Here he's manipulating Hillary Clinton. Here he's manipulating Barack Obama in a very racist caricature. Here he's manipulating black football players kneeling, taking the knee for the national anthem. Try Googling Soros puppet master and see what you come up with. Okay? This is really remarkable. And finally, we get to the Pittsburgh shooter. Professor Cargill already showed some of these texts of his, again, drawing on that Christian heritage, and again, to make clear this is not just a kind of a political stance, this is metaphysical, this is about fundamental good and evil. And then these they're not tweets, they're on a particular right-wing social media outlet called Gab. He likes to bring invaders in that kill our people. I can't sit by and watch my people get slaughtered. Screw your optics, I'm going in. This was broadcast just a couple of hours before the shooting. About 2.5 weeks earlier, why hello there, Hias. You like to bring in hostile invaders to dwell among us? We appreciate the list of friends you have provided. That sounds like a threat. What is HIAS? HIAS is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. It was founded about 100 years ago in this country, initially to help to assist with the immigration of Jews who faced persecution elsewhere, and was very important for many decades in that regard. In the last 15 years or so, they have become extremely vocal. They have essentially refocused their mission in taking a position that rather than simply rescuing people because refugees are Jews, rather rescuing people because they themselves, HIAS, are Jews, saying we need to have an open door. We need to welcome the stranger, okay? In light of particularly HIAS was in the media a certain amount, again, around the time of the refugee crisis, the Syrian civil war, basically saying the United States must be much more generous in admitting refugees from the Syrian civil war. And of course, the administration was very, very slow to move in that direction and really did not. Rather, basically accommodated fears of sort of stereotypes of Middle Eastern Muslim terrorists who might be in that group. Now, that was a couple of years ago with the Syrian refugee crisis, the fear that somehow if you admit these desperate refugees, there might be terrorists among them. What's going on now? What's going on now, it appears in the mind of Robert Bowers, the shooter, is the Honduran caravan, the caravan of desperate refugees from violence in Honduras that's making its way through Central America to then arrive at the American border and apply for refugee status, to apply for asylum, which is a legal thing to do. You may come to the border and apply for asylum. The administration spread the rumor that within that caravan are hidden Middle Eastern terrorists. So think about the layering here, a kind of a Islamophobic fear of Middle Eastern terrorists embedded in Latin American refugees who are associated with racial otherness and with poverty and in many people's minds with gang warfare, all masterminded by the Jews, by HIAS, okay? This is, in a very small number of words, an amazing distillation of anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, the importance of Jewish whiteness in connection with color-based racism. That's where I want to leave things today. I thought about finding a kind of a happier image to leave at the end, but I'm going to leave it to Rabbi Hugenholtz to help us think about responses.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And just pull them off just pull them out.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to, keep up my rabbinic image of dealing with ancient texts, so I have some very ancient original handouts written on elephantine papyrus because I do not have a PowerPoint. So my apologies for that. I just want to briefly say a little something about myself that will contextualize some of my remarks. I am a proud immigrant, and my congregation knows I'm a proud immigrant because they, God bless them, had to wait 18 months for my visa to come through to assist me with my immigration. I am from the Netherlands. I'm from Amsterdam, the city which was for a while a safe haven for Anne Frank and her family, which unfortunately could not keep that promise of safety. A long-time beacon of hope and support and tolerance of the Jewish community in early modernity. And I have now settled via a detour, a 7-year detour in the United Kingdom in the Hawkeye States. So I'm very happy to be here, and I'm also very devastated to be here for this reason. Because this is not the America that I had envisioned going to. And I still hold out in my heart the hope of everything about America that I love and respect and cherish. I would like to dedicate my remarks to the 11 martyrs, and I choose that word intentionally, the 11 martyrs who were killed Kiddush Hashem for the sanctification of God's name. Joyce Feinberg, Richard Gottfried, Rose Mellinger, Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irvin Younger. Zichronam Kedusha Livracha, may their sacred memory be a blessing. So, in order to kind of pick up where Dr. Heineman left off, a little bit of detail about Jewish demographics in Europe. My remarks will be based in two perspectives, a little bit of information about the European experience and some of my personal experiences interwoven with that, and then some remarks on the theological, spiritual, moral implications of what we are seeing today, and what the message of Judaism is regarding that. So, as one can expect after the Second World War, which murdered 6 million Jews, Jewish demographics in Europe have crashed over the years. Currently, there are about 1 million Jews, a little over 1 million Jews living in Europe. For contrast and comparison, there are about 6 million Jews living in the United States and about 6 million Jews living in Israel, and there are about 14 million Jews worldwide. We are a tiny, tiny sliver of the world population. Even, if you would get a pie chart of the world, dividing up the world religions, you would have Islam and Christianity and Confucianism and Hinduism and Buddhism. And then there is like a little slice that says other religions. And then there's a little slice that is too thin to show up on the pie chart. That's us. So, in 1939, there were about 16 to 17 million Jews worldwide, and 9.5 million lived in Europe. And of course, that number collapsed after the Shoah, which is the Hebrew word for Holocaust. We don't like the word Holocaust because Holocaust means burnt offering, and it belies the suggestion of a very toxic theology that somehow the murder of 6 million Jews was an offering to God. A God who would require such an offering is a God I would categorically deny. Let's be clear about that. After the Second World War, the Jewish world population came back a little, but has never fully recovered to its pre-war numbers. And now there are about 1.4 million Jews in Europe, just 10% of the world's Jewish population, down from 57%. And that is significant because it says something about the shifting cultural import of Judaism in Europe. Judaism in Europe has been in Europe for 2,000 years, throughout Roman history and beyond, and our cultural contribution is diminishing just because of demographic realities. I would like to speak about 3 case studies: the Netherlands, United Kingdom, and France. So the Jewish population in the Netherlands is about 30 to 40,000 Jews. Before the war, when the Dutch general population was far lower than the 17 million is today, it was 140,000. We lost over 100,000 of our community in the Shoah. The Jewish population in the United Kingdom, which was not terrorized by the Nazi occupation, is about 300,000. And the Jewish population in France, which has its own complicated history linked to the Shoah, but also linked to large immigration waves of Mizrahi and Sephardi Jews from North Africa after the war, is the largest and most powerful Jewish community in Europe at almost 500,000. Now, 500,000 compared to 6 million in the United States really illustrates the discrepancy, that even by European standards, that is a powerful community, but it pales in comparison to the vibrancy and the viability of the American Jewish community. So there's been a rise of anti-Semitic incidents over the last number of years, and I speak about this with some trepidation, because I really believe that all oppressed groups and all minorities should stand together, and the relationships between Muslims and Jews in the United States has been one of mutual support and kindness and brotherhood. And I myself have many Muslim friends back in Europe as well, and the Muslim community of Pittsburgh has already raised $200,000 in support and solidarity with the Pittsburgh Jewish community. And I think extremely highly of the contributions that Islam has made and continues to make to world civilization. But we do have to acknowledge that there are two core types of anti-Semitism in contemporary Europe. There is the classic white supremacist neo-Nazi anti-Semitism that you have spoken about so eloquently, and there is a newer form which in a way is a derivative of this anti-Semitism, of Islamist anti-Semitism, which claims to link itself to the plight of the Palestinian people. That is the fig leaf under which that prejudice operates. This is no judgment on the Palestinian people whatsoever. I just want to be very clear about that. This is also no judgment about the complex situation that exists in the Middle East. This is just about the conspiratorial narratives that are driven and that have been drip-fed from Western white supremacist anti-Semitism into Arabic or Islamist fundamentalist anti-Semitism. They manifest in different ways, but I think at the core they share a common cause and a common analysis and a common function. This means that Jews in Europe have felt increasingly unsafe. We have had incidents in France which have been the most devastating. There have been murders. Just think of the shooting at the Hyper Caché, the kosher supermarket in Paris, by Amédée Coulibaly, a terrorist, an Islamist terrorist, and the murder of a Holocaust survivor in her home in 2015. And there has been a mass exodus of Jewish French citizens to Israel, peaking at 700,000 in 2015, which is now leveling off. So there have been many anti-Semitic incidents in France, and in France you have the situation where you both get the anti-Semitism from the Islamist ideology, and I am saying Islamist, not Islamic. Let me be very clear about that. Okay. And from the Front National, which is the white supremacist ideology encased in a political structure of a far-right party that almost won the presidential elections 2 years ago. In my home country, in the Netherlands, Amsterdam Jewish communities have been targeted by vandalism, including a kosher restaurant where I used to get the most delicious Yemenite chicken soup. And a community center, loads of anti-Semitic and graffiti and vandalism, and also a number of incidents of grave physical violence. I cannot walk around Europe wearing this on my head. Some Jews even hide this. Imagine not being able to practice your faith openly. Imagine not being able to serve God as you feel called to serve God openly, irrespective of the whiteness of my skin. And that is certainly not to belittle the experiences of people of color. If anything, we have to fully understand that anti-Semitism is the origin myth of many types of bigotry, and we stand with people of color at all times in their struggle for dignity and equality. And certainly Jews of color, as Dr. Heineman has already indicated, face a double burden and a double trauma in our communities, and we white Jews must fight very hard to honor that. But my whiteness will not protect me when I'm wearing this. Just think about that. In the most complex situation of the three case studies is the United Kingdom. I came to the United Kingdom in 2010, feeling very welcome. I am an EU national. I have a Dutch passport, which allows me to move freely and work freely in all 27 member states. You may have heard of this little thing called Brexit, which far it be from me to make partisan remarks, but a collective exercise of shooting oneself in the foot, where the British, by a very tiny and slim majority, voted to leave the European Union, and it has led to a huge upheaval. And in the wake of the nativist impulses of the Brexit vote, and not all Brexiteers are nativists, some have real concerns about the size and the lack of transparency of the European Union and its attendant institutions, or have concerns about national sovereignty. I may or may not agree with that, but not every person who questions the European project is a nativist or a racist, but they do tend to go together a lot. And hate crimes spiked in the wake of the vote in late June 2016, and I was in England at the time, and again my whiteness did not protect me when I was shouted at, not as a Jew. I wasn't visibly identifiable as a Jew, but I was identifiable as a non-Brit because I was speaking Dutch to my son on the bus, by a bigot who basically told me that I should go home and there is no place for immigrants like myself, and why don't I speak English, and could I speak English? To which I replied in fluent English that my command of the English language is of no concern to him. But it was an unsettling and unpleasant experience. And in the wake of those anxieties about immigration and a changing economy and a changing world, which is also linked to climate change and the pressures, the social pressures and the economic pressures we face, it is easy to lash out with xenophobia. And as part of that xenophobia is anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is the socialism of fools. This is a quote from the Social Democratic Party in pre-war Germany. And what that means, the socialism of fools, is that it is an easy, gullible answer to placate disempowered people. It's not the true answer. It's not a real analysis. It's a conspiracy theory. It is the socialism of fools. And so when Jeremy Corbyn became the Labour leader and the contender for becoming Prime Minister, a huge amount of controversies erupted around his leadership and his views on Israel, and a culture of toxic anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which has made many British Jews, I lived there for 7 years, I know a lot of these British Jews, a lot of them are dear friends of mine, has made them feel very unsafe. And a lot of British Jews are considering leaving England because they feel that The political structures have not dealt adequately with their concerns, and they feel unheard in their concerns. Legitimate criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. When you hold Israel to a different standard than other liberal democracies, that's when it starts getting dicey, right? And that lies at the linchpin of anti-Semitism, and also where the two subcategories of anti-Semitism converge, between the anti-Semitism that can, again, I choose my words carefully, that can come out of the pro-Palestinian left. It's not true that the entire pro-Palestinian left is anti-Semitic, God forbid, but there is that danger, as well as the anti-Semitism of the far right. And it's like the image that we saw of the Jew as the capitalist and the Jew as the communist. Astrophysicists are always looking for a theory of everything. My husband's a physicist. He's intrigued by this idea of having one model to explain the entire universe. As a theologian, I'm not convinced I'm going to find it, but hey, I'm just going to stick to my science. But anti-Semitism is a theory of everything based on a flawed premise. And it unifies these different impulses that we have to shift blame, to want to point the finger at someone else. And that is why it's absolutely important to understand this oldest of hatreds, this mother of hatreds. I just want to move away from the case studies and talk a little bit about my personal reflections and the spiritual implications. I am very proud and very glad and very relieved to be here. I never cowered in fear. I was sensible, but I never cowered in fear. I love Europe. I have lived in 5 different European countries. I identify with the European projects. But it breaks my heart to see what's happening in Europe. And I had come to America, the economic migrant that I am, looking for a more hopeful future. And I have found a lovely congregation, which I serve very happily, in a beautiful college town. And I've got, the countryside only a few minutes drive in any direction. And I have a great quality of life here. And the sense of loss and pain and anger that I experienced when I was standing on the pulpit reading from the book of Genesis that fateful Shabbat Saturday morning, and I was whispered in my ear that Jews had been shot and murdered in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, I cannot put into words. It was a visceral, physical response, as if every aspect of my being, every sinew of my being was fused shut around my sense of Jewishness, as if I was reduced to that and only that. At that moment, I was a Jew and nothing else. And I was a Jew who was in pain because my people are being slaughtered in the nation that has been so kind to Jews historically. And Jews call Yisrael Arevim Zeh Ba'zeh. All the Jewish people feel responsible to each other. We're mishpacha. We're family. Anti-Semites like to think that we all know each other. Well, I hate to... We do all know each other. I'll grant them that. Right? We are a close-knit, supportive community. And by only a few degrees of separation, we know the people who were murdered. So, what do we make of anti-Semitism? And what do we make of the spiritual implications of anti-Semitism? Why is there an increase of anti-Semitism? I think it points towards an existential crisis. We talked about the religious sources, the metaphysical evil. We are a world in a moral crisis. We are a world that is experiencing spiritual upheaval. this is not just about secularism. There's nothing wrong with secularism. I come from a secular family. The people I know and love are proud atheists and agnostics with a strong moral core. But the question we need to ask ourselves as a culture is, what are the values that we bring to the challenges of our current time? And there are 3 core texts in my tradition that talk about anti-Semitism, which is kind of an anachronism in with regards to the biblical text, but they are instructive to this day to explain what anti-Semitism is and how it affects us. There is the archetype of Pharaoh from the book of Exodus. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who knew not Joseph, and he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal craftily with them, lest they multiply. And when it comes to pass that when there befalls us any war, they also join themselves unto our enemies and fight against us. The idea of Jews as the 5th column. Then there's the archetype of Amalek, who saw Jews as despicable, vulnerable targets. From the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you were coming out of Egypt, how he met you on the way and attacked your rear ranks, all the stragglers at your rear, when you were tired and weary. And he did not fear God. Therefore it shall be, when the Lord your God has given you rest from your enemies all around, in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to possess and as inheritance, that you will blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget. Attacked us in the rear when we were a caravan exiting Egypt. When we were weakest and most vulnerable, the anti-Semites attacked us. And then there is the 3rd archetype of Haman or Heineman. And when I say Haman, the Jews in the audience will say, boo, there you go. Right? Who saw Jews as culturally alien and as a political threat. And when Haman saw that Mordechai did not bow or do him obedience, and Haman was full of wrath, but he disdained to lay hands on Haman alone, on Mordechai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordechai, so that Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Persia. Right? So we get these different images. The Jews as the dirty immigrants, the Jews as the weaklings, the Jews as the schemers, the Jews who refuse to assimilate, the Jews who refuse to give honor to the power structures. And you know what? Good for us. We are all those things. Because the one commandment that is given in the Torah again and again and again, and that is the guiding principle for my life and my rabbinate, is you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in Egypt. And the Torah likes to be parsimonious with its words. They didn't have Tipex, okay? It could have said, you shall love the stranger. And that would have been fine, a good ethical injunction. But it says, for you were strangers in Egypt, because Judaism wants us to experience the heart of the stranger and to internalize radical empathy. We are the conscience of the world. Disclaimer, we are not the only conscience of the world. I play on Team Torah. I represent Team Torah. That's my business. There are beautiful religions out there that are not my religion, which I love and respect and am inspired by and learn from. I get paid to play on Team Torah. Not by George Soros. Right? And so it behooves me to say that because of our mission to be a light unto the nations, our mission of transmitting ethical monotheism, i.e. the idea that because we have a divine parent, we are all radically egalitarian in our sibling relationship as human beings with each other. that we know the heart of the stranger and the poor and the vulnerable, the orphan and the widow. We are an exact inverse of anti-Semitism. We are the kryptonite of bigotry. At least I hope that we rise to that high moral calling as Jews, that we are the bigot's kryptonite. That we are the canary in the coal mine who says to the world, century after century after century, this is what happens when you start dehumanizing. And we can tell you that it ends at the gates of Auschwitz if we are not careful. And we are the voice that have to remind all of humanity of that. And what the anti-Semite tries to do is paint a caricature of Judaism that is racialized, that makes a mockery of our complex and nuanced identity. We are not a race. We are a diverse, global people that is part of a religious civilization. We are a covenant people that serves God and Torah, or at least shares a common destiny and a common set of values and identity with each other. We are a people. We are a tribe. We are a culture. We are civilization. We are a religion. You can become Jewish. You can leave Judaism. Once you've had the bagels, you might want to stay. Right? We are fluid and organic and evolving and beautiful and rich. And the anti-Semite wants to collapse that in this ugly caricature. But we are the first immigrants. And we can model in our own richness and our own pluralism and our own, even, your New Testament quote showed Jews were bickering back then. We haven't stopped bickering. But that is a strength. Our difference is a strength. Our message is a strength. Our otherness is a strength. And those are all things to cherish and to model. We bring that historical sensitivity, and we bring the commandment to love the stranger. And you know what? We are not going to close up shop. Hashtag show up for Shabbat. Come to the synagogue. Seriously, you're all welcome. We might have to jiggle around with the Kiddush team, but you're all welcome. We will not...
Bagels on Saturday.
Oh, there you go. Brugers is going to have the time of their lives. We are not putting up our walls. We will secure ourselves. We will be realistic. We will make ourselves safe. But we will not close up shop. We will not be cowed by anti-Semitism. I will stand on that pulpit this Shabbat with pride, with joy, with love, and welcome each and every one of us, each and every one of you, into the embrace of Judaism, into the values of Judaism, and bear those values out to repair the world, letoken olam b'malchut Shaddai, under the sovereignty of God. And I take supreme pride in that. And not only that, I feel honored and privileged to be that. And I hope that each of you will nourish yourselves in whatever way from the tree of life that Judaism can offer. Just by sitting in this lecture, by understanding our people, by understanding our story and the challenges we have faced. I'm very grateful for the wonderful turnout here and for your willing hearts, so that we can put an end to each and all bigotry forever. Ken Yeh Ratzon v'nomar Amen.
Amen.
So we all went over our time. This room is required by another class at 6:30, but what I'm going to suggest is we have a satellite, because this is being live cast and because it's an overflow crowd, we have room 66 Schaefer Hall. So anybody that would like to now engage in discussion, please come join us in room 66 Schaefer Hall. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. you.